His touch made me feel life in the brightest colors. What he did and why I gave into it, I will tell in this video. You will not believe what such a touch can lead to. Before we get into the details, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from. I never expected his touch to linger. I never thought a single moment could leave such an imprint, like a shadow stretching across my thoughts, refusing to fade. But it did. And now, no matter how much I try, I can't escape the memory of that afternoon in Willow Creek Park. Nathan was gone again, swept up in another urgent meeting with some client whose name I'd long stopped bothering to remember. He barely looked at me as he left, tie askew, coffee in hand, his mind already miles away. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of our house, surrounded by the echo of a life that no longer felt like mine. The air was too still, too heavy. When Ryan, my stepson, wandered into the living room, I grabbed my jacket before I even realized what I was doing. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. He looked up from his phone, one eyebrow raised. "Where?" "Anywhere but here. Willow Creek." Ryan hesitated, but when I opened the door, he followed. The drive felt like I was holding my breath underwater. Ryan sat slouched in the passenger seat, his headphones draped around his neck, scrolling aimlessly through his phone. The city blurred past in streaks of green and gray. When we pulled into the parking lot, I barely noticed I'd parked crooked. "Come on," I said, already stepping out. The sun was relentless, beating down through the golden autumn leaves, but it didn't ease the tension coiled in my stomach. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and the faint sweetness of the pond. All around us, families sprawled across picnic blankets, kids ran laughing through the trees. It was everything my life wasn't: warm, full, alive. We walked along the winding path, Ryan trailing a few steps behind, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. I stole a glance at him. He'd changed so much in the past year, his once slender frame broadening, his stride more confident. Sometimes I forgot he was still just a teenager. When we reached the pond, I sighed and gestured toward a weathered wooden bench. "Let's sit for a minute." Ryan didn't argue. He dropped onto the bench beside me, stretching his legs out in front of him. "You've been weird lately," he said suddenly, not looking at me. I blinked. "What?" "You just seem off." His voice was casual, but his words landed sharp, precise. I forced a laugh, too light, too hollow. "Are you fine?" Ryan finally turned his head, his gaze locking onto mine. "You don't look fine." Something about the way he said it made my chest tighten. He wasn't just making conversation. He wasn't asking out of politeness.
"I'm just tirret, I murmuret."
Of Nathan? The question was a gut punch. "Ryan." "You don't have to lie," he interrupted, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I see how he treats you. He's never around. When he is, he barely talks to you. It's like you don't exist." I swallowed, my throat dry. "It's complicated." "No, it's not." His voice was quiet but firm. "You don't deserve that." I looked away, my hands twisting in my lap. How could he see so clearly what I'd spent years trying to ignore? For a moment, neither of us spoke. The distant hum of the park surrounded us, birds chirping, a child's shriek of laughter, the gentle ripple of water against the shore. But between us, the silence was something else entirely. "I just want to make sure you're okay," Ryan said, his voice softer now. "Thank you," I whispered. My throat felt tight. He nodded, his eyes lingering on mine a second too long. My pulse jumped. "We should go," I said abruptly, pushing off the bench, so fast I nearly tripped. The walk back to the car felt heavier, the space between us filled with something I didn't understand, something I wasn't ready to name. Every brush of his shoulder against mine sent my heart racing. By the time we pulled into the driveway, Nathan's car was nowhere in sight. Of course it wasn't. Ryan climbed out without a word, disappearing upstairs. I stood in the doorway, my fingers tightening around my keys, my breath shallow. I stayed in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the empty coffee mug Nathan had left on the counter that morning. My reflection in the window looked unfamiliar, like a stranger trapped in a life that no longer fit. Something had shifted today. Something irreversible. And as much as I wanted to pretend otherwise, I knew I couldn't unfeel what had started. I told myself I was imagining things. That the moment at the park was just that, a moment. Fleeting. Insignificant. But then it happened again. It started innocently, or, at least, that's what I kept telling myself. Ryan and I had found a quiet spot near the pond, a place where the city noise faded into rustling leaves and the occasional splash of a duck breaking the water's surface. He stretched out on the grass, his phone in hand, while I pulled a blanket from the bag. The sun was relentless, pressing down on my skin like a slow burn. I reached for the sunscreen and hesitated. "Can you help me with this?" I asked, holding out the bottle. Ryan glanced up, his brows knitting together. Sure." I sat down with my back to him, handing him the bottle. "Just my shoulders and back," I said, trying to keep my voice light. He hesitated for a beat before squeezing the lotion into his hands. The first touch was cold, mechanical. Just a simple favor. Nothing more. But as his hands moved, spreading the sunscreen across my shoulders, something shifted. His touch slowed. Or maybe it was just me, hyper-aware of the way his fingers pressed, smoothed, lingered a second too long. "It's nothing. It's just sunscreen." But then he reached the base of my neck, and his fingers paused, just for a moment, barely noticeable. A flicker of something electric shot through me, sharp and unwelcome. I held my breath. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Yeah," I said too quickly, my voice tighter than I meant it to be. "Thanks. That's enough." His hands lifted, and I felt the absence of his touch like a jolt. I turned, expecting some kind of smirk, some teasing remark, but his expression was unreadable. Neutral. Or maybe just thoughtful. "You missed a spot," he murmured, nodding toward my shoulder. "It's fine," I snapped, sharper than I intended. Ryan blinked at my sudden shift in tone, then shrugged and stepped back, shoving his hands into his pockets. "All right." I forced myself to look away, to focus on the water, on anything but the way my skin still tingled where his hands had been. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. We walked a little, talked about nothing, and eventually ended up at a food truck near the park's edge. I forced myself to act normal, to shake the lingering tension. Ryan seemed fine, indifferent even. But every so often, I'd catch him watching me. A glance held too long. An expression I couldn't quite read. By the time we got back to the car, the sun had started to sink, casting long, golden shadows across the pavement. Ryan tossed his backpack into the back seat and slid into the passenger seat. "Thanks for today," he said as I started the engine. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the road. "Sure." But the air between us felt thick, like something unspoken was waiting to be acknowledged. When we pulled into the driveway, Nathan's car was there. The sight of it should have been grounding, should have snapped me back into the reality of my marriage. Instead, it felt like cold water dousing something I didn't want to name. Ryan went straight to his room without another word. I lingered in the kitchen, staring at the bottle of sunscreen still sitting on the counter. Something had changed today. Something subtle, but impossible to ignore. And I was afraid. Not of Ryan, but of myself. I told myself I was imagining things. That the moment at the park was just that, a moment. Fleeting. Insignificant. But then it happened again. It started innocently, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. Ryan and I had found a quiet spot near the pond, a place where the city noise faded into rustling leaves and the occasional splash of a duck breaking the water's surface. He stretched out on the grass, his phone in hand, while I pulled a blanket from the bag. The sun was relentless, pressing down on my skin like a slow burn. I reached for the sunscreen and hesitated. "Can you help me with this?" I asked, holding out the bottle. Ryan glanced up, his brows knitting together. Sure." I sat down with my back to him, handing him the bottle. "Just my shoulders and back," I said, trying to keep my voice light. He hesitated for a beat before squeezing the lotion into his hands. The first touch was cold, mechanical. Just a simple favor. Nothing more. But as his hands moved, spreading the sunscreen across my shoulders, something shifted. His touch slowed. Or maybe it was just me, hyper-aware of the way his fingers pressed, smoothed, lingered a second too long. It's nothing. It's just sunscreen. But then he reached the base of my neck, and his fingers paused, just for a moment, barely noticeable. A flicker of something electric shot through me, sharp and unwelcome. I held my breath. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Yeah," I said too quickly, my voice tighter than I meant it to be. "Thanks. That's enough." His hands lifted, and I felt the absence of his touch like a jolt. I turned, expecting some kind of smirk, some teasing remark, but his expression was unreadable. Neutral. Or maybe just thoughtful. "You missed a spot," he murmured, nodding toward my shoulder. "It's fine," I snapped, sharper than I intended. Ryan blinked at my sudden shift in tone, then shrugged and stepped back, shoving his hands into his pockets. "All right." I forced myself to look away, to focus on the water, on anything but the way my skin still tingled where his hands had been. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. We walked a little, talked about nothing, and eventually ended up at a food truck near the park's edge. I forced myself to act normal, to shake the lingering tension. Ryan seemed fine, indifferent even. But every so often, I'd catch him watching me. A glance held too long. An expression I couldn't quite read. By the time we got back to the car, the sun had started to sink, casting long, golden shadows across the pavement. Ryan tossed his backpack into the back seat and slid into the passenger seat. "Thanks for today," he said as I started the engine. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the road.
Sure.
But the air between us felt thick, like something unspoken was waiting to be acknowledged. When we pulled into the driveway, Nathan's car was there. The sight of it should have been grounding, should have snapped me back into the reality of my marriage. Instead, it felt like cold water dousing something I didn't want to name. Ryan went straight to his room, without another word. I lingered in the kitchen, staring at the bottle of sunscreen still sitting on the counter. Something had changed today. Something subtle, but impossible to ignore. And I was afraid. Not of Ryan, but of myself.
Вы сказали. Продолжай. Текст не сокращай.
Chut сказал. I caught him staring again. It wasn't the first time, and I knew it wouldn't be the last. It was subtle, his gaze lingering a second too long, his eyes flickering toward me when he thought I wouldn't notice. But I did. And each time, my pulse kicked up, my breath turned shallow. I told myself it was nothing. A trick of my imagination. A leftover feeling from that moment at the park. But deep down, I knew better. The days that followed blurred into an uneasy rhythm. Ryan seemed to gravitate toward me more than before, sitting closer at the dinner table, finding small excuses to be in the same room, offering to help with things he never cared about before. It should have felt innocent. Maybe it was. But every time he entered a room, the air felt heavier, like an invisible thread kept tugging at something I wasn't ready to face. One afternoon, I was folding laundry in the living room when I heard his footsteps. I didn't have to look up to know it was him. "Need help?" he asked. "I've got it," I said quickly. He sat down anyway, grabbing a towel from the pile and folding it neatly. For a while, neither of us spoke. "You've been quiet," he said suddenly, not looking at me. I froze for a fraction of a second before forcing a casual smile. "Just busy." Ryan exhaled, setting the folded towel aside. "No, it's more than that." I swallowed. "I don't know what you mean." "You don't seem happy." The words hit like a punch to the ribs. I gripped the fabric in my hands, focusing on the texture of cotton against my fingers, willing my heartbeat to slow. "With everything," he clarified. "With Nathan. With this house. With..." His voice trailed off. I turned my head sharply, meeting his gaze. "Ryan, stop." His lips pressed together, but he didn't look away. "I just mean you don't have to pretend with me." I opened my mouth, ready to dismiss it, but the lump in my throat made it impossible. Instead, I turned back to the laundry, my fingers trembling as I reached for another shirt. "I'm fine," I said softly. But we both knew that wasn't true. That evening, as I stood at the stove making dinner, I felt his eyes on me again. He was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, but every now and then, I'd feel that familiar weight of his gaze, like a quiet, unspoken question. Nathan came home late, his usual rushed apologies spilling out as he kissed me absently on the cheek. He barely glanced at Ryan before heading upstairs to finish some last-minute work. The three of us ate dinner in near silence. At one point, Ryan's foot brushed against mine under the table. I flinched. My fork clattered against my plate. "Sorry," he murmured. Nathan didn't notice. He never noticed. Later that night, I lay in bed beside my husband, my mind replaying the day in sharp, fragmented moments, the look in Ryan's eyes when he asked if I was happy, the way he watched me, the way my own breath caught in my throat when our hands brushed in the laundry room. I turned over, away from Nathan, staring into the dark. He was already asleep, his breathing slow and steady. But I was wide awake, because I knew something was shifting, and I was powerless to stop it. I thought putting distance between us would help. That if I avoided him, if I busied myself with chores, errands, and meaningless tasks, whatever this thing was, this slow, creeping awareness, I could smother it before it took root. But distance didn't make it fade. If anything, it made it worse. Ryan noticed, of course. He was perceptive in a way that made me uneasy, watching me with careful, quiet scrutiny. At first, he didn't say anything. But the tension between us was suffocating, thick with the weight of something unspoken. One evening, as I stood at the sink washing dishes, I heard him enter the kitchen behind me. My shoulders stiffened. I knew he was there before he even spoke. "You've been avoiding me," he said. The words sent a shiver down my spine. I swallowed, focusing on the warm water running over my hands, the clink of plates against porcelain. "I'm not," I said, though even I didn't believe it. "Yes, you are," he countered, stepping closer. "You barely look at me anymore." I closed my eyes for a brief second, exhaling slowly. "Ryan, please." "Please what?" His voice was quieter now, but no less intense. "Pretend none of this is happening? Pretend you don't feel it." I turned sharply, gripping the edge of the counter as I faced him. "This isn't a conversation we should be having." His expression hardened. "Why not?" "You know why," I snapped. He stepped closer, and I hated the way my heart reacted, the way it lurched inside my chest, betraying me. "You keep saying this is wrong," he murmured, his eyes locked onto mine, "but you never say you don't feel it." I couldn't breathe. The air felt too thick, too heavy. "Ryan." He lifted a hand, reaching toward me as if drawn by some invisible force, but I jerked back, the movement sharp and immediate. A flicker of something dark passed over his face before he clenched his jaw and took a step back. "Fine," he muttered. "You want to pretend? Go ahead." Before I could respond, he turned and left the kitchen. I gripped the counter, my legs unsteady beneath me. My reflection in the dark window looked foreign, eyes too wide, chest rising and falling in quick, uneven breaths. This has to stop. But even as I told myself that, I knew it was already too late. The days that followed were unbearable. The weight of our last conversation pressed down on me, making every interaction feel strained, unnatural. Ryan was distant, but not in the way I needed him to be. He wasn't ignoring me, he was waiting, watching. And the worst part? I wanted him to. I was unraveling, thread by thread, and he could see it. Then came the moment that changed everything. It was late. Nathan had gone to bed hours ago, and I was in the kitchen, nursing a glass of wine, trying to quiet the noise in my head. The house was silent, the kind of silence that made everything feel heavier, more significant. I didn't hear Ryan come in at first, but then I felt him. "You're still up," he said. I turned, my heart thudding painfully at the sight of him. He was leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Couldn't sleep," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. And then, before I could think better of it, I said, "Do you ever feel like you're trapped in a life that doesn't belong to you?" Ryan's gaze darkened. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quiet but certain. All the time. I let out a slow breath, setting my glass down on the counter. "I don't know who I am anymore." Ryan took a step closer. "Maybe you do," he said. "You're just afraid to admit it." I should have stopped him. Should have told him to go back upstairs, to forget this conversation ever happened. But I didn't. Because deep down, I didn't want him to. And when he reached out, fingertips brushing my wrist, I didn't pull away. The moment stretched, dangerously fragile, hanging in the space between us. And then, just like that day in the park, something shifted. Something neither of us could take back. I should have pulled away. I should have said his name, firm and final, put a stop to whatever this was before it spiraled any further. But I didn't. Instead, I stood frozen as Ryan's fingers lingered against my wrist, warm and steady, his touch burning through my skin like a brand. I told myself it was just a second too long. That if I moved now, if I stepped back and forced a laugh, I could pretend this moment had never happened. But when I finally met his gaze, the look in his eyes told me the truth. We had already crossed the line. My breath hitched. I saw the hesitation in him, the war playing out across his face. Should he let go, or should he push further? A single choice, hanging in the air between us, ready to tip in either direction. And then I heard it, the creak of the stairs. Ryan dropped his hand instantly, stepping back so fast it was almost unnatural. I turned, my pulse slamming against my ribs, just as Nathan appeared in the hallway, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Why are you both still up?" he mumbled, voice thick with exhaustion. I forced myself to move, to act normal. I couldn't sleep. Ryan just came down for some water. Nathan blinked blearily at us, then grunted. "Come to bed," he said, directing the words at me. Then, to Ryan, "Don't stay up too late." And just like that, he turned and shuffled back upstairs. Ryan and I stood there, the weight of what almost happened still thick in the air. I forced myself to move first. Without another word, I turned, grabbed my glass, and walked out of the kitchen, up the stairs, and into the bedroom I shared with my husband. I slipped into bed, curling onto my side, my back to Nathan. His breathing evened out within minutes, completely unaware of the fact that something irreversible had just been set in motion. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to sleep. But all I could think about was Ryan's touch and the terrifying truth that I had wanted more. The next morning, I avoided Ryan completely. I woke up early, left before he came downstairs, and spent the entire day out of the house. I told Nathan I had errands to run, but the truth was, I just needed space. I needed to breathe, to figure out how to fix whatever this was before it consumed me. But when I finally came home, exhausted and unsettled, Ryan was waiting. He was sitting on the couch, watching TV, but as soon as I stepped inside, he muted it and looked at me. Just looked. "Did you go out just to avoid me?" he asked, his voice unreadable. I exhaled slowly, setting my bag down. "Ryan, what are we doing?" he asked suddenly. The directness of it caught me off guard. "Nothing," I said too quickly. "We're not doing anything."
His jaw tightened.
"That's not true." I swallowed hard, shaking my head. "It doesn't matter what's true. It can't happen." His eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I saw something break inside him. "You felt it too," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. A lump formed in my throat. "That's exactly why we have to stop." Ryan let out a sharp breath, dragging a hand through his hair. "You think just ignoring it is going to make it go away?" "Yes," I whispered. "Because it has to." He stared at me for a long moment, then gave a small, humorless laugh. "You really think you can pretend forever?" I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came. Because deep down I knew he was right. This thing between us, it wasn't going away. It was growing, taking root in the space where loneliness had lived for too long. And I was running out of ways to stop it. I threw myself into denial. I told myself that if I kept my distance, if I treated him like nothing had changed, Then eventually, the tension would fade. That the weight of that night, the near touch, the unspoken words, would slip into the background, lost in the noise of everyday life. But the thing about unspoken things? They don't disappear. They fester. Ryan didn't push. Not at first. But he watched me, waiting, his patience an unspoken challenge. He knew I felt it, knew I was trying to run from it. And maybe that's why he didn't let me. It started small. A glance across the room, his gaze burning into mine until I had to look away. A touch that lingered a second too long, like he was testing the boundary I was so desperate to rebuild. And then came the moment that shattered the illusion entirely. It was late. Nathan was working late again. I was in the laundry room, folding clothes, trying to focus on the rhythmic motion of smoothing out fabric, anything to keep my mind from spiraling. I didn't hear Ryan come in, but I felt him. The air shifted, thickening. I turned, and there he was, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Ryan," I said, my voice tight. He didn't respond right away, just watched me. Then, finally, he said, "Are you ever going to talk to me?" I exhaled, setting down the shirt in my hands. "We don't need to talk." His jaw clenched. "You really think ignoring it is going to change anything?" "I don't know what you're talking about." He let out a humorless laugh. "You do." I shook my head, turning back to the laundry, pretending I wasn't trembling. "Ryan, please. Just let this go." But he didn't. Instead, he stepped forward. One step, then another, closing the space between us until he was right there, so close I could feel his warmth, the electricity humming between us. I couldn't breathe. "I see how he treats you," he murmured. "Like you're invisible." I swallowed hard, gripping the counter behind me. "This isn't. You deserve more than that," he said, voice low, steady. "You deserve to be seen." I felt the words like a physical thing, pressing into the cracks I had spent years ignoring. His hand lifted, fingers brushing the side of my arm. It was so light, so fleeting, but it sent a shiver through me, sharp and undeniable. I should have stepped away. I should have stopped him. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, frozen, as Ryan reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers trailing along my jaw for just a moment too long. My breath hitched. "Tell me to stop," he murmured. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. His gaze dropped to my lips. I forced myself to move, to take a step back, breaking the moment before it shattered everything in its path. "This can't happen," I whispered. Ryan's eyes darkened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "You don't mean that."
I do.
But the way my voice wavered told us both it was a lie. His jaw tensed, his eyes searching mine. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. I stood there for a long time, my heart pounding, my hands trembling. I had won this time. I had stopped it. But I knew, deep down, this wasn't over. Not even close. I thought I could keep pretending, that if I ignored it long enough, buried it under routine and silence, it would disappear. But desire doesn't disappear. It waits. Ryan started avoiding me. At first, I told myself it was a good thing. That space would make things easier. That I could breathe again. But the truth was, I felt the absence of him like an ache. The way he used to look at me. The way he always seemed to be near. Now, when he entered a room, he barely glanced at me. He left before I did, stayed out late, barely spoke. And it shouldn't have hurt, but it did. Then one night, everything unraveled. Nathan was gone on another business trip. The house was quiet, empty. I was in the kitchen, staring at the stove, knowing I should make dinner, but too restless to do anything about it. I didn't hear Ryan come in. But when I turned, he was there, standing in the doorway, watching me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "Are we just going to keep pretending?" My throat tightened. "Ryan, I need to know," he interrupted, stepping closer. His voice was quiet but unshakable. "Did you ever feel it? Or was it just me?" I opened my mouth, ready to lie, but I couldn't. Not this time. Yes, I whispered. Something in his expression shifted, like the confirmation was both everything he wanted and everything he feared. He took another step, closing the space between us. My pulse pounded. I should have stopped him. I should have walked away. But I didn't. His hand lifted, hesitating for just a second before his fingers brushed against my arm, trailing upward, light as a whisper. My skin burned where he touched. "Tell me no," he murmured. I couldn't. His hand slid to my waist, his grip firmer now, like he was daring me to push him away. I didn't. Instead, I exhaled, my body betraying me as I leaned the smallest fraction closer. That was all it took. Ryan's lips crashed against mine, and I let him. For one reckless, impossible moment, I let myself forget. Forget who I was supposed to be. Forget the consequences. Forget everything but the way he felt, his hands, his warmth, the way he kissed me like I was something fragile and breakable, but also something he could never let go of. And then reality slammed back into me. I tore away, breathless, shaking.
No, Igaspet.
Ryan's eyes were wild, his breathing unsteady. You don't mean that.
I did.
I had to. This was a mistake. I whispered. It can't happen. Pain flashed across his face, but he didn't argue. He just nodded, jaw clenched tight, before stepping back. And then he was gone. I stood there, my heart pounding, my world collapsing around me. Because I knew this wasn't something I could undo. It wasn't something either of us would ever forget. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's discuss if this story resonated with you. Support the channel, like, subscribe, and click the bell to not miss new releases.